Everyone, we're going to talk about one of the basic but important aspect about JavaScript variables. So what is a variable? Variable is liable to change. For example, variable pay. That means that it's not a constant pay. So that fluctuates, that changes its state. That's what a variable pay means. So from a technical point of view, a variable is a container or identifier. Otherwise, we can call it as a name, something to identify that stores value or data. That's a technical term. So you can think of an empty box which can store some values. That's what's the typical literal meaning of variable. And why do we use variable in automation? Basically, we want to store a lot of values. For example, if you're automating a browser, if you're automating an API, so they will store a lot of constant, lot of variables. For example, URL would be your constant value, or your payload will be a variable one because you will change depending on the way you post some request, right? So that's the real use case of why we need to understand variable better. And looking at the variables part, in JavaScript, we can declare a variable in three different statements using three different statements, one using var, another using let, and third using const. So these are the three different ways we can declare a variable. So that variable will store some value for us. So first thing, var. So var declares a variable, optionally initializing it to a value. And one interesting fact about var is the only variable type or statement which was available before ES6, which means before 2015, before ECMAScript 2015, this was the only variable used to declare a variable in JavaScript. So in ES6, they introduced two other new block scope variable, which is called a statement called let and const, which are mostly used in a lot of our real-time use case. We will be either using let or const. So we'll talk about them later why. But definition of let is it declares a block scoped and local variable, optionally initializing it to a value. So this means it supports only at the block level. So we'll talk about what is a block level and why it supports only those area and how are we using it. And similar to let, const also supports the block level scoping, but it's a read-only named constant. So when we say read-only, what is it? So we'll not be able to write something. So it's just only for reference. We can only get the value. We will not be able to write it back. So that's the definition of var, let, and const in JavaScript variables. And there is a star there. Preferably wherever possible, prefer to use let. And we'll talk about let, where we are using let and where we are using const. So now coming to the important section of 10 things we must remember when we are dealing with a variable. So let's go one by one. We'll start with the first thing. Variable name should start with a letter, underscore, or dollar symbol. This is a rule. This is an identifier rule in JavaScript. We can't skip that. So let's straight away jump into one demo and then we'll talk about that one by one. So the first rule is we can't start a variable with anything other than a letter, a dollar symbol, and underscore. So let me declare a variable. Let me say that at the variable name, let's assume that we are automating an API, right? For example, I may just save this API endpoint as XYZ endpoint, for example. So this is my typical the end API endpoint. But if in case if I change this to let's say that 1, I may have a number of APIs, so I want to just store it as uniquely as 1. Then immediately if you want to change it, then it throws error. So meaning that an identifier keyword cannot immediately follow a numeric literal. So that's the error. Automatically before it compiles, then it throws an error. So we'll not be able to start anything in a letter. Or can we start any other special character? For example, can we start with an hash symbol? No, it can't be. So that's the rule. You can only start with the letter, or if I just wanted to change it to underscore, this is possible still. There is no error. Or if I want to just change it to dollar symbol, then this is also possible. So that's the first rule. So we can only declare a variable of only starting with either a letter or underscore or dollar symbol. That's our first rule. Now let's go back to the second rule. So system reserved keyword cannot be used. For example, if I declare the same variable in a different way, let's say that I want to just declare this as throw for some XY reason. So this doesn't allow. If you hover on this, it says that expression expected. So obviously this is throw itself is a system reserved keyword, as you can see here. For example, throw new error. So this will resolve fine now, right? So this throw is the system reserved keyword. So any of the system reserved keyword we cannot be used as a variable name. So be mindful whenever you want to store a variable, think of whether it is a system reserved keyword. The system reserved keywords are endless, starting with if, else, throw, break, continue, default, implements, interface. There are quite a few of them. So be cautious that whenever you deal with an interface, that should be a unique identifier where you can identify it. So that solves our second rule about variables. And third one, let and constant are preferred over where. So why we think we should avoid using where possible. So let's take an example. Let me just define a function. Let me name the function name as why not where, for example. Interestingly, why not where, and then let me create a simple function, and then let me declare a variable inside the function. Let's say that a equal to 1, and then within that function let me also create a conditional block if, and I'm just going to be hard coding this as true. This will always execute if true, then a equal to 10. So this is just to show an example, but not to define a function or anything. So right, so this is my simple function called why not where, and this is inside of it there is a variable as declared as let and a equal to 1. If true, then let a equal to 10. So I'm just going to print the value of a after the if block. So if I just click on this down arrow, so this is my if condition block. That's the block scoped. And if I just wanted to print something outside of the block and then just say that console.log, and then I'm just going to say the value of a is, I'm just trying to print the value of a here. So what do you think will be get printed? Is that when it executes, will it print the value as a1 or 10? And for example, if I just, when I call the function, let me just call the function and why not where as a function name, and I'm going to call, this doesn't accept any argument. So I'm just going to call the function. The way we can run the program and then say node, and my file name is variable dot. I'm not in there, so let me just move into cd and js core, and then node. If I just type in variables, and you can see this, the value of a is 1. So this is what we need, because when we write a large number of code, large block of code, large function, then we would be able to support the block scope, because the life of a here lasts only within this block. It does not, this value is not exposed outside the block, because that's a block scope variable for let. But interestingly, if I change this let, instead of declaring a variable with let statement, if I just change it to where, let's see what's going to happen. If I change it to where now and execute this, what you're seeing this is the value is 10. So, but in a lot of real-time project, when you declare a big function, this is not what you wanted to see when you execute the line number 6, because this will get you a wrong result. So what is happening internally when you declare a variable? So when you can declare a variable with where statement in two different scope. One within the function. So within the function, if you have the same name, the state of the variable is shared, meaning that at the line number 2, the value of a will be 1. When it executes the value line number 4, the value will change it to 10. So the state is shared irrespective of the block. So that is the downside of using where. And mostly when we do automation, and personally I don't declare any variable with where so far. So that's a downside, and that's the one reason why we should be avoiding using the where, because we will get an unexpected result, because we may be thinking that when we execute this line, I should be able to access anything at this scope level, because this is where I can only access it. So that's the reason why we're not actually using where as our function. So that clarifies the second another rule about why not we are using where, right? Let me just put some annotation. Alright, let's talk about the next rule. Another rule is const variable must be initialized with the value. So in our example, for example, let's think that I'm going to deal with an API as part of my automation. I'm just going to deal with an API. I just want to store my endpoint. Because when we automate a browser or when we automate an API, we should be always getting an URL. If it is a browser, we call it as URL. If it is an API, then we call it as generally endpoint. So let's assume that we want to deal with an endpoint and then say, I'm just save it as, let me name this as XYZ endpoint and store some value. So I'm just, let me say this is my variable value would be https xyz.com some endpoint get users or something like that. It's just a fake one. And now I've declared it. So declare using a variable called const. So why we are using a const? Because it's a read-only value. So once I fix this value, I will not be able to, there is no need for me to change this value because it's a fixed value. For a particular endpoint, that will be my fixed value. So I will not be changing it often. That's the reason we are declaring it as a constant type. And then this is just a read-only reference. But if in case if I just don't declare, don't assign this value for now, and then trying to console this out, console.log, and then let me say this, I want to print this statement here. And if I just print it here, and let me comment this out for now. And I'm just going to execute the same code. So what you're seeing here is a syntax error, missing initializer in constant declaration. So node itself throws an error saying that you are missing an initializer. So whenever you declare a constant variable, always remember to initialize it with the initial value. So the value that I was having, it was an some website https or something like that, xyz.com some user, right? So get users, whatever, that's an endpoint. So it is always a good idea to initialize a value. So this means that we are initializing this value to the variable constant type xyz endpoint. So that's the another rule about constant. So let me just put constant, right? Okay, that's another rule. So now that we are clear with that, whenever you declare a global variable, for example, any constant type, let's say, for example, you are saving a browser name, saving an endpoint, or saving some constant value, then you always go with the constant type and make sure that you are initializing with it the value. Another point number 5, constant variable cannot be reassigned. For example, if you are changing the value of it, but if you run this program now, then you will not get this problem. So then you are seeing this actual endpoint here. But what if I just change this value, because this is a variable type anyway. So if in case if I just want to change this to something else, for example, let's assume that your endpoint has changed and you're at some point in time, at some lines, you are trying to reassign the changed value. Instead of this, for example, I'm going to put, let's say, for example, my endpoint is changed to, instead of get user, maybe just a case change, right? I'm just putting it as a get users, this one. So if I try to print the value of the console now, so if we just print this now, what you're seeing here is type error, and what it is saying, assignment to constant variable. So you cannot reassign a value to the constant variable. So once you assign the value, that's it. So you are storing that value. You can only get it as a read-only reference. So that's another rule about constant. So be careful. So when you deal with a constant type of variable, then make sure that you are just referring that variable name. We are not changing its value. But if in case if you do with let, this is still possible. So if I just run it now, because you change the declaration type as a let and you are reassigning a new value, then we are expecting to see a new value. So you can see that this get user has changed to a lowercase. So that's how it works. So make sure that whenever you declare it, keep it as a constant, but don't reassign any value. So that's the rule number about 5. Rule number 6, constant variable will be capitalized. In usual general convention, whenever you have a constant variable, always make sure that you are initializing with the uppercase character, which means capitalized value. So I'll change it as x, y, z, and then say endpoint. So that should be the general convention, so that you are referring. So whenever you read a variable throughout your line of code, and then by looking at this is all capitalized, so there will be a trigger that says that this could be a constant type of variable. right? So this is not possible in variable type. I'm going to just delete it, and this is what it is. So now this will be a proper constant variable. So when you read a line of code or anything, that you may think that this could be a constant type of variable. So that's our rule number 6. Rule number 7. So multiple variables can be declared in a single line. This is possible, but remember to separate them with a comma, not a semicolon. You can separate statement with semicolon, but not with the variables type. So how do we then do it? So rule number 6, let's assume that I'm also wanted to store different values. Like for example, when you make an API call, generally you need an endpoint. Then you will need authentication mechanism, right? Either username or password, or maybe a payload. So in case if I declare multiple variables, let for example, if I say I need to also have a username, and I'm just initializing with an empty value because I'm going to assign from maybe from another endpoint or something external file. I'm just reading a file, I may be getting a username. But in this case, so this is still a valid declaration, so because I'm declaring a username with value initializing with the empty value. And another thing, I'm also getting a password, and I'm just initializing with an empty value, comma, I'm also getting another payload, and maybe with a string type as well. So we will talk about more about the string, the type of variable, but for now we'll just, this is also still possible. Control K, sorry, Alt A, Control A, K and F is for Mac, but Windows will have a different value. So because I'm using the prettier extension, this automatically indents this code for me. But if you don't have it, then you will have to just format your code. Right, so this is also still possible, but if you don't like it, you can have a still even in the same line as well. This is also possible. If you just save it, this will also look fine. So if in case if you want to just print out console.log, or just I'm using an extension, so just type CLG and then type username, and this will just print an empty string. For example, if I have test user or something, then you can print that value as a test user here. Right, so this will be useful and handy, and will look clean. If you are declaring multiple variables, separate them with a comma, don't put a semicolon. You may be just making a minor mistake when you deal with it, because you may be thinking it is a statement. No, it won't work. But if you just, now if you try to print the password, for example, let's see what's going to happen. So if I just put a password here and then execute this code, it just giving us an empty value. And ideally what will happen is, this won't allow you to separate by a semicolon. Let me put another semicolon here. Let me assign some real value. Let's password is password. Alright, so this may be a recent addition in Node version 14, but I've been using version 12. Then if you make this semicolon in version 12, then it does not allow. Obviously it will make a mistake. So I see quite a few improvements in version 14 of the Node, which is the current stable version. So this may be allowed. So, but always think that there is a provision where you can add multiple variables in a single row. So this is also still possible. So that's about our another rule. Now let's talk about the next rule. Strict mode prevents the use of undeclared global variable. So what is the undeclared global variable? Undeclared global variable. So we know that we can declare a variable using 3 different terms: one, var, let, and const. What is undeclared? So if you ignore one of the types, one of the statement, then it will directly declare a variable. For your example purpose, let me think that I'm just having an auth token or something like that as part of my API. I'm just providing an auth token and just assign some value. So let's say that some value I'm just assigning. This is my auth. But here, remember, I'm not putting any of the statement like const, let, or var. So what happens internally? So this will become a global variable. That means throughout this file, if I refer auth token anywhere, then this value will be retrieved. So that will give us some unexpected result, because you may be having a different auth token for different endpoint. In that case, you may be just confused with the same value. So it is a bad practice to declare a variable without any of the 3 statement, like var, let, or const. So that's why That's why. So this is still allowable. This is still possible. If you just console log and then try to print that value, let's say that auth token, and this is still allowed, and this value will become visible. So you can just print this now. You can see whatever the last statement that the console.log, this is my auth token, right? Let me just comment this out so that we focus one thing at a time. So this is still possible, but one thing, if I change the file name at the top in the line number 1 and use something called use strict, and when you refer a lot of the external code, you will often find the statement. So if it is a plain JS file, use strict will be used with a semicolon or without semicolon, doesn't matter, but use strict within a quotes. So this will become that if you run it the code now, what you were seeing there, so we are getting an error now saying that reference error, auth token is not defined. So in a use strict mode, which means in a strict mode of JavaScript, this is not allowed. So this will basically prevent the developer or prevent the programmer to avoid making mistakes. So I would suggest when you are dealing with the plain JS file, always go with the first line use strict, because this will prevent a lot of the semantics, and this is just one of the use case. So there are quite a few of them. We'll see them later. But this is the one use case of why we need to use strict at the top level, at the first line, right? So this will prevent it, so that if you now declare it as a let, then this will go through fine. Now we can see that value of the auth token. So that's another use case why we need to use a use strict at the top level. So remember, if you're dealing with the JS file, always use the use strict at the top, because this will prevent quite a few semantics error. But when you deal with the TypeScript, and this is internally taken care. So we'll see them when we talk about TypeScript later, but for now you can understand and get an idea of why we are using use strict at the top. Now, so we're progressing, okay, and now let's look at the last but one, which is variables or names are case sensitive. For example, if I just put auth token instead of this token, let me keep that as it is. And instead of this, if I refer the token as, I just forgot to put T in a uppercase character, just put it as here. Then if I just run the program, it won't give us the same value, because it will say auth token is not defined. So it is case sensitive. So you should be able to refer with the same name that you're declaring, including the casing. Whatever case that you use, whether lowercase or uppercase, that should be used exactly the way it is defined. That's about our 9th rule. And 10th rule, we cannot have the same name for anything else. If we have a declare a variable called, let's say that I'm just enabling the payload, for example. So now I have the payload as a variable declared with let. And if I, in case in the future lines, so when you keep writing the code, and if you keep moving on, at some point in time with the same scope, if you declare that same payload as let, for example, I'm just going to have another an object with the same name. So this is a incorrect name, so payload, and then copy this and put it here, and this is my payload. So I'm declaring this is a string type, and this is an object type. So we'll talk about the different types in the next subsequent session, but this payload is basically of a string here, but here is an object type. So now if you just try to console this payload, let's see what's going to happen. CLG and then type in payload. Let me just comment this out. So here I'm having a variable name as payload. I'm also having a variable name, the object name is also payload. So let's try and print this out and then see what's going to happen. What you're seeing here is password is not defined. Yeah, I think I know why, because we are using the semicolon, so it's complaining that the password is not defined at this stage. So if I change it to comma, so the initial rule is still valid, so you can only be able to just go with the comma only, not a semicolon. So if I just do it now, you can see that syntax error, identifier payload has already been declared. So that's what it is preventing, that because you have the same variable name with a string type, but at the line number 23 you are trying to use the same name of the object type, but still we can't be able to use it. So this same rule goes for a function also. We will not be able to use the same payload name as a function name also. So make sure that whenever you deal with an identifier, whenever you deal with an variable, object, array or function, always make sure that you have a unique name. That's about the rule number 10th. So if you understand all of these rules clearly and practice yourself well, and you will, trust me, you will avoid a lot of practical errors when you write a automation code. And that's all for now. We'll look at the next topic in the next session.